In this video, I'm going to show you my start to finish process in making a custom piece of jewelry that a client asked me to make in replacement of a ring of highly sentimental value that she unfortunately lost. Took a little bit of hunting down just the right turquoise for this ring, but in the end, we got a really good quality Bisbee turquoise, which is a particular mine that produces turquoises that's got a good reputation for a good reason. This stone has really excellent color and hardness, and it was very nicely cut. So once I found that, we were able to build a design around it. The first thing I needed to do was measure out a length for the actual shank of the ring. And so we based this on the size of the client's finger for the finished product. I made this one a little bit smaller because I knew I was going to hammer it out a little bit with some texture. So you see me rounding it up, cleaning up that join, and then preparing to solder it closed. So I've got my solder chips there, and I've fluxed it, and I'm going to melt that solder to join the ring, and then I put it in a pickle bath to remove oxides. While that's happening, I am making the backing plate for that stone. It's got a flat back. That style is called cabochon. And so I've shaped this and smoothed it out to be a perfect fit underneath that stone. After that, I have to create a strip of thin metal that surrounds the stone. That's called the bezel. It's got to be just high enough that I can push that top bit down curved against the stone to keep it in place. So here I'm soldering up the bezel to enclose that. Again, that goes in the pickle. So now I'm creating another bit of the backing. Because the cabochon is very flat and the stone is fairly big, we wanted it to sit up away from the finger a little bit. So I'm creating this extra sort of free-form piece that conforms to the shape of the backing, but creates just a little bit of a riser that the shank is going to sit against. And you'll see what I mean by that later if that's not really clear here. So I'm just shaping that up and cleaning it with files and sanding paper, as you can see, making sure it's nice and flat so I can attach the two layers together. So they're out of the pickle, I'm drying them out. Here you see I've got my, the shank, it's rounded up. I'm making sure that I'm bringing it to the right size for the client's finger while I'm doing the hammering. And once it's the right size, I don't want to deform it any further. I switch to the rawhide mallet just to make sure I'm shaping it without increasing the size any further. So it ended up with a really nice texture on the band. I've got to make sure it sits totally flat so it's not warped or deformed from that slightly tapered ring mandrel that I'm using right there. I've just taken it over to my ring sizer, compressing it a tiny bit back into shape that also gave a little bit of a texture to the edges of the rings that I really like. So there I'm testing how that little bit is going to sit against the shank, needing to make sure that it's centered and has enough surface area to attach to solder those pieces together. Testing the fit of my stone in that bezel, which it's very thin, so it's very shapeable, but during the process of bending it up, it wasn't exactly the right shape, so I need to fit it perfectly to the stone. So once the bezel is the right shape, I can fit in that piece of back plate and make sure there's no gaps there because I need a tight fit for the soldering. And I'm checking the placement of that riser as well as the band or shank. So here I'm going to be marking around the edge to see where the placement of the riser will be, smoothing out with a burnisher here to just ensure nice contact between the back plate and the bezel. Checking again with the riser, I'm going to use a scriber here to mark so that I'll know where to place that, and also starting to look at how to get the right angle and symmetry and placement of that band. So I'm marking some things, and you'll see here cutting some notches with both my jeweler's saw, and also I'll be using a file here to increase the surface area and make a good contact point for where that sits against the riser piece. So once I've got that sorted out, I'm checking the placement again. Then I've got my special pair of pliers here that I can use to stamp both my private maker's mark as well as the quality mark for the metal. So I've got a 925 stamp that I use for sterling silver. That signifies that sterling silver is 925 parts per thousand of pure silver. Here I'm setting up for my soldering, so I cut some little solder chips. I can place those on my piece if it's clean and I've got my flux on there already. And so I'm going to be performing a procedure here called sweat soldering. So instead of putting the two pieces to be joined together right away, I'm going to melt some solder on the backs of both of those two individual pieces. And then I clean that surface up for both of those pieces, and then I can sandwich them together and remelt the solder. So once I do some kind of soldering operation, I quench the metal into a dish of water. That helps create the right amount of hardness for the metal. And then I also will be brushing on a solution before I do some soldering operations. You'll see here it creates that little bit of green flame or whatever. That helps stop the metal from oxidizing, because sterling silver does have a tendency to oxidize both during the soldering process and over time. That's due to the copper part. So here you see I've got those two layers together, and I'm remelting that solder that I applied previously, and then I quench it, and then it goes back in the pickle. Then I need to prepare to solder the back plate to the bezel. So in retrospect, I didn't need to pickle that last soldering operation because solder only flows where the join is clean, and if I had not put it into the pickle to clean it up, then there might have been enough oxides to prevent me needing to worry about that previous solder seam re-melting. But instead here, I've applied that yellow paste you see, yellow ochre. It will stop the flow of solder. And so then I can just place my flux and my solder chips around the perimeter where I do want to melt the solder to join the bezel and the back plate. This is moving super fast, so... a couple things you did not see me do here because I lost the footage, is I cut out a hole in the back plate in the middle of the riser piece, and that performs two functions. One, it lets you see some of the stone from the back side, and also if when I put my stone in the bezel it got stuck when I wasn't ready for it to be there, I would be able to push it out through the back. So I sawed out that hole with I pierced a hole with my drill, cut the hole out of the middle, and also performed the soldering operation to attach the shank or band to that backing piece. So we missed seeing that, but all I'm doing here is cleaning up everything and making sure that I have everything smooth and filed and polishing up things, because once I have my stone in there, I'm not going to want to mess with it a lot because then I risk damaging the stone. So doing a lot of cleaning up here with, these are just wooden sticks that have different grits of sandpaper glued onto them. So we go progressively finer until basically the sandpaper is effectively actually performing a polishing function. And here I have a polishing motor, and I use special compounds to shine things up. Again, we use different grits for that. So now I've got it cleaned up enough, I can start preparing to do the stone setting. So I have a vise I put the ring in. I've got a little hammer and a tool there where I'm pushing around the little bit of height that comes up off the bezel that is just enough to keep a curve over the outer edge of the stone, and I've got to work in a specific fashion, sort of starting at opposite ends and then bringing towards a nice smooth outer piece continuous. So there I've finished the basic setting. Now what's left is just to polish up in case there was any bit of marking that happened on that bezel while I was doing the setting. And you can see that I'm protecting the stone with my thumb because the sandpaper could ruin the nice polished job that was already done on the stone. You can see I've got a little bit of paper towel there protecting the shank or band of the ring inside my ring clamp. I don't want to be marring any of the parts that I already polished. So I'm working very carefully here. The next thing I'm going to be doing is using a burnisher, which is a polished steel tool that I'm going to be rubbing around the edges there, just making that nice and smooth and even. And then the last thing that I need to do is do a final polish. So instead of using my big polishing motor, I use basically a miniaturized version of the same thing using my motorized hand tool, which mine is Fordham, but you might be familiar with Dremels. It's kind of the same idea. So I'm using a rouge polishing compound. When I'm done the polish, I can just use a soft toothbrush and some warm soapy water to clean off the rest of that rouge, and the project is complete. I hope you enjoyed watching the process behind making that custom turquoise and sterling silver ring. Gave you a little bit of insight into the technical process of making jewelry and the care involved in enacting a client's vision for a custom jewelry piece. Hey, it's Steph. I hate this intro. Everything you need to know about this video in 10 seconds or less. It's about me making a ring that a client asked me to make out of turquoise and sterling silver to replace one of highly sentimental value that she lost. And this is going to be way more than 10 seconds, but I don't care because I picked that number arbitrarily. Can I piece together all of this disjointed stuff? Can't link that, but in the description you will find a link to my store. Don't let your intros be boring.